Midnight, we welcome you to this journey through one of West Virginia's most disturbing recorded historical cases. Before we begin, we invite you to share in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts are reaching. 024, the setting for what local newspapers would later call a most troubling affair, became the small mining community of Blackwood Hollow in the autumn of 1890, nestled in the remote hollows of McDowell County, West Virginia. A footnote in county records is all the disappearance of 17 men over 3 years would have remained, were it not for the 1964 discovery of a series of ledgers during the demolition of an old boarding house on the town's eastern edge. 054, the very fabric of historical record would be challenged by what those ledgers revealed about brothers Samuel and Elijah Thornton. So much so that county officials reportedly ordered all documentation sealed until 1999. By that time, the original files had been reported missing from the county archives. 116, an account pieced together from newspaper clippings, personal correspondences, and interviews with descendants of Blackwood Hollow residents who have broken decades of silence is what follows. As many Appalachian tales do, the story of Blackwood Hollow begins with coal. Significant coal deposits in the remote valley were identified in 1883 by surveyors from the Eastern Mining Consortium. 144, the Blackwood Coal Company had been formed within months, with capital investments from Philadelphia and New York industrialists eager to exploit the region's natural resources. A rudimentary settlement had formed around the tipple by year's end, after the first mineshaft was sunk in the spring of 1884. By 1886, some 200 men worked the Blackwood seam extracting high-quality bituminous coal, company records indicate, which was transported via a newly constructed spur line connecting to the Norfolk and Western Railway. 218, the typical pattern of company towns throughout Appalachia was followed by Blackwood Hollow. Simple frame houses for married workers were constructed by the company, while single men were housed in crowded barracks near the mine entrance. Effectively binding workers to the operation through perpetual debt was a company store operating on a scrip system. 239, haphazard was the town's development, growing organically along the narrow valley floor with structures clinging to the steep hillsides. A population of nearly 500 people was boasted by Blackwood Hollow by 1887, though census records from the period are notably incomplete, particularly regarding the transient workforce drawn from recent European immigrants. 302, into this rapidly expanding industrial settlement arrived the Thornton brothers in the spring of 1887. His experience in providing for the needs of working men and his brother's skills as a cook of considerable talent were emphasized in Samuel Thornton's letter dated February 12, 1887, particularly in making humble ingredients satisfying to laboring folk. 329, an enthusiastic reception to the proposal is indicated in Superintendent James Whitaker's response dated March 3, noting that the company was finding it increasingly difficult to properly house the expanding workforce and that private enterprise of this nature would be most welcome. Purchasing a large 2-story structure that had previously served as storage for the Blackwood Coal Company, the Thornton brothers arrived in Blackwood Hollow in April 1887. 357, a letter from Samuel Thornton to James Whitaker, superintendent of the Blackwood operation, inquiring about opportunities to establish a private boarding house is included in company correspondence preserved in the West Virginia State Archives. Positioned advantageously between the tipple and the newly constructed railroad spur, the building stood approximately 1 mile from the main mine entrance. 422, as butcher from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Samuel Thornton, the elder of the two at 36 years of age, listed his previous occupation, according to property records filed with the county clerk. His younger brother, Elijah, 32, was documented simply as cook. With enthusiasm by the mine operators was received the opening of a new boarding house to accommodate the influx of single male workers, as coal production expanded rapidly throughout McDowell County. 452, in an insurance document filed with the county in May 1887 appears a detailed description of the property. Divided into a large dining hall capable of seating 30 men at once, a kitchen, a small office, and private quarters for the proprietors was the main floor of the structure, which measured approximately 60 feet by 40 feet. 517, the upper floor contained 12 rooms of varying sizes designed to accommodate between 1 and 4 boarders each, with a total capacity of 30 men. A small smokehouse and root cellar built into the hillside stood behind the main structure, which Samuel Thornton described in the document as essential to our operation, as proper food preservation is the cornerstone of our business model. 544. A degree of privacy unusual in the cramped confines of a mining town was afforded the establishment by the property's isolated position, set apart from the main settlement and partially screened by a stand of oak and hickory trees. Within weeks, the Thornton Boarding House had filled its 12 rooms with primarily immigrant miners, men from Italy, Poland, and Hungary, who spoke limited English and had few connections in the area. 613. That 26 men listed the Thornton establishment as their residence is indicated by company payroll records by June 1887, with their board payments automatically deducted from their wages. Throughout the region, the arrangement was typical of mining operations. A steady income for the Thorntons was effectively ensured by the company facilitating payment directly to the boarding house proprietors, while further binding the workers to the company through financial obligations. 642. For two things, the boarding house quickly established a reputation by all accounts. Cleanliness unusual for such establishments in mining towns, and meals that were remarkably hearty compared to the usual fare offered to transient workers. One of the few first-hand accounts of the Thornton operation during its early period is offered by the Reminiscences of Thomas Hatfield, recorded in 1952 as part of a Works Progress Administration oral history project on mining communities. 712. Those foreign fellows at the Thornton place were the envy of many, recalled Hatfield, who worked as a timekeeper for the Blackwood Company from 1886 to 1892. While most boarding men got salt pork and beans day in and day out, the Thornton brothers served up proper stews and roasts that you could smell cooking all the way down to the company office when the wind was right. Many a time I considered giving up my room in town to take a place there, though something about the brothers always made me hesitate. There was a queer intensity to them that put me off. 738. Large quantities of vegetables, flour, and sundry goods, but curiously very little meat compared to other establishments of similar size, were purchased by the brothers, as indicated by a ledger from the Blackwood Company store. An elderly clerk recalled years later, when questioned about this discrepancy, that Samuel Thornton had mentioned keeping his own livestock up in the hills, though no record of such a farm exists in county land registers. 803. Without question was this explanation apparently accepted, as many residents of mining communities maintained small livestock operations in the surrounding hills to supplement their diets and incomes. Particularly notable in retrospect is that no contemporary resident ever reported seeing the brothers transporting animals or meat from the hills to their establishment. 834. To themselves the brothers kept, with Samuel handling the business affairs while Elijah remained almost exclusively in the kitchen. Neither attended the Methodist church that served as the center of community life in Blackwood Hollow, with Samuel explaining to the mine superintendent that Sundays were their busiest day for preparing meals. Perhaps unusual in the close-knit environment of a mining town, this social isolation did not apparently arouse suspicion at the time. 915. The transient nature of mining populations, particularly in the boom period of the 1880s, meant that many individuals moved through such communities without fully integrating into local social structures. As a businessman of some education and refinement, Samuel Thornton, by all accounts, presented himself. 937. Articulate and formal, with penmanship that one clerk described as uncommonly elegant for a man in his position, show his communications to be in company correspondence. He maintained regular contact with the mine superintendent, providing monthly reports on occupancy and occasionally advocating for improvements to the road connecting the boarding house to the main settlement. 10 o'clock. A methodical attention to detail and a careful cultivation of official relationships are revealed in these reports, preserved in company records. In the historical record, Elijah Thornton remains a shadowy figure, rarely mentioned in company documents and apparently seldom seen outside the confines of the boarding house kitchen. 1022. A heavy-set, quiet man who spoke with a slight stammer when forced to engage with strangers is how the few descriptions that exist portray him. Approximately 8 months after the boarding house opened occurred the first troubling incident. An Italian miner named Giuseppe Fiorelli failed to report for his shift on a Monday morning in December 1887. 1042. His foreman noted his absence but didn't immediately report it, as it was not uncommon for men to leave without notice for better opportunities in neighboring operations. A receipt showing that Fiorelli had paid his board through the previous Friday and had mentioned plans to travel to Cousins, Pennsylvania was produced by Samuel Thornton when questioned. 1103, considered resolved. The matter was until 3 weeks later when a letter arrived addressed to Fiorelli from his wife in Naples. Simply a wife writing to her husband about family matters was found by the company clerk who translated the correspondence, but the very existence of the letter suggested that Fiorelli had not planned a departure. 1126, that perhaps the miner had been suddenly called away and hadn't had time to notify his family was suggested by Samuel Thornton when asked about this discrepancy. In the transient world of mining camps, such explanations were readily accepted. Addressed to My Dear Giuseppe and dated November 18, 1887, the letter from Fiorelli's wife, preserved in company records, offers a poignant counterpoint to the official acceptance of his disappearance. 1155, family matters in Naples are detailed in the 4-page letter, which mentions the sender's hopes of joining her husband in America the following spring and concludes with a request for him to write more regularly as your last letter arrived more than 2 months ago. There until the archival examination in the 1960s, the letter was apparently filed with the company records after attempts to forward it failed, remaining. 1221, regarding his disappearance, no record exists of anyone contacting Fiorelli's family in Italy, and company payroll documents simply note his employment as terminated December 4, 1887. Without further incident at the Thornton Boarding House past the winter of 1887–88. Stable occupancy with new arrivals quickly filling any vacancies is indicated by company records. 1248, that Mr. S. Thornton reports all rooms occupied with a waiting list of 6 men seeking accommodations is mentioned in a notation in the superintendent's log from February 1888, suggesting that the establishment maintained its positive reputation despite the unexplained departure of Fiorelli. The same log entry notes approval for the Thorntons to construct an addition to their smokehouse, with the company agreeing to provide lumber from the company sawmill at a reduced rate, indicating a continued good relationship between the brothers and mine management. 1323, in March 1888 occurred the second disappearance when a Polish miner named Stanislaw Wojcik failed to appear for 3 consecutive shifts. Having arrived in Blackwood Hollow only 4 months earlier, Wojcik, like Fiorelli, was relatively new to the operation. That he had no family in the area and, like many immigrant workers, sent the majority of his wages back to relatives in Europe is shown by company records. 1354, that Wojcik had left suddenly after receiving a letter was reportedly stated by Samuel Thornton when questioned by the shift foreman, though no such correspondence appears in company records. Less official attention was generated by Wojcik's disappearance, as no subsequent mail arrived for him, unlike the Fiorelli case. Only a brief notation is contained in the mine superintendent's log. S. Wojcik, Polish, departed employment without notice. Removed from payroll effective March 18, 1888. 1419, in retrospect, what is notable about the Wojcik case is a curious entry in the company store ledger dated March 16, 1888, 2 days before his official departure. An unusually large quantity of salt, pepper, and herbs along with several yards of cheesecloth is shown in the entry as purchased by Samuel Thornton. 1448, while such purchases might be unremarkable for a boarding house operation, the timing coincides precisely with Wojcik's disappearance. Corresponding with subsequent disappearances would later be identified similar patterns of purchases, suggesting a regular process that required specific supplies. 1510, however, at the time, no connection was made between these mundane transactions and the missing men. With a frequency that, in retrospect, should have aroused suspicion, similar disappearances occurred over the next 2 years. That between January 1888 and October 1890, 16 additional men, all boarders at the Thornton establishment, failed to report for work and were subsequently listed as voluntarily terminated is shown by company records. 1540, in each case, similar explanations were provided by Samuel Thornton. The men had moved on to other opportunities, had returned to their homelands, or had simply left without explanation after paying their debts. Their spacing, approximately one every 6 to 8 weeks, and the fact that the missing men were almost exclusively those without family connections in the area was what made these disappearances particularly unremarkable to mine officials. 1608, moreover, turnover rates exceeding 100% annually were experienced by the coal industry of the era. Individual absences rarely warranted investigation, as men disappeared and new workers arrived with such regularity. When examining the profiles of the men who disappeared, a pattern emerges. 1638, with limited English proficiency and few social connections beyond their immediate workplace, they were almost without exception recent immigrants. That many were listed in company records as sending remittances to family in Europe suggests they had dependents but no local ties. The least desirable positions in the mine were typically theirs, working the low seams or in poorly ventilated sections where more established workers refused to go. 1709, men came and went so regular in those days, particularly the foreigners, that unless they owed money or left equipment behind, nobody much noticed when they moved on, reportedly remarked one mine foreman when questioned years later. The brothers' careful attention to documentation was what prevented anyone from connecting these disappearances. 1730, with Samuel Thornton often personally delivering final wage assignments to the company office, each departed miner had his account settled in the company books. That the signatures authorizing these transfers had all been written by the same hand would be revealed by examination of these documents in 1964, despite purporting to represent 17 different individuals. 1756, but in 1890, with limited record-keeping practices and overworked company clerks, such details went unnoticed. Indeed, the brothers' establishment continued to thrive, with Samuel even approaching the mine superintendent in September 1890 about expanding their operation to accommodate 4 additional rooms. 1826, though in ways that apparently did not arouse suspicion, the Thornton brothers maintained their isolation from the broader community throughout this period. By those who dealt with him as unfailingly polite but reserved, conducting necessary business efficiently but rarely engaging in the social discourse that characterized life in the small community was Samuel described. 1849, an even more elusive figure remained Elijah, with many in the town reporting they had never seen him at all. The brothers' absence from church services, community gatherings, and even the saloons where most men socialized might have seemed peculiar in another context, but the demanding nature of running a boarding house provided a ready explanation for their reclusiveness. 1911, a curious duality in its reputation was developed by the Thornton establishment itself. For exceptional cleanliness and meals of unusual quality it was known on one hand. On the other, a reluctance to take accommodation there was reported by some miners. Thomas Hatfield's oral history again provides insight. Despite these advantages, there was something unwelcoming about the place, though you couldn't put your finger on just what. The rooms were clean, and the food better than what most boarding men got, but fellows who stayed there didn't seem to make friends in town. They kept to themselves, almost like the brothers had them under some spell. Some of the local men started calling it the quiet house on account of how little talk or laughter you ever heard coming from it, even with 20 or more men living there. 1956, fully occupied remained the boarding house throughout its operation despite these vague misgivings. That demand for rooms consistently exceeded availability is indicated by company records, with Samuel Thornton maintaining a waiting list of potential boarders. The premium rates charged, approximately 15% higher than other boarding options in the area, did not deter applicants, suggesting that the quality of accommodations and meals outweighed both the cost and any nebulous discomfort associated with the establishment. 2030, for the Blackwood Coal Company, ideal was the arrangement, a private enterprise addressing housing needs without requiring company investment while still maintaining indirect control through the payroll deduction system. For over 3 years had the Thornton brothers operated their boarding house by the summer of 1890 without arousing official suspicion. 2053, no collective concern had been generated by the disappearance of 17 men during this period. Treated as an isolated incident explained by the transient nature of the mining workforce was each case. As reliable, if somewhat peculiar, members of the business community had the brothers established themselves, with Samuel's regular reports to mine management maintaining a veneer of transparency. 2121, Their establishment had expanded slightly with the addition of a larger smokehouse and storage cellar built into the hillside behind the main structure. Improvements that Samuel explained as necessary to maintain our standards of quality as demand increases. 2148. The true nature of the Thornton brothers' operation might never have come to light had it not been for an unseasonably heavy rainfall in late October 1890. Significant erosion along the hillside behind the boarding house was caused by the downpour, which lasted 3 days, where the brothers maintained a small smokehouse and storage cellar. 2211. According to an account published in the McDowell County Register on November 3, 1890, a portion of the hillside collapsed, exposing what was described only as evidence of most troubling activities. Notably vague in its details, the newspaper account indicated that the mine superintendent had summoned the county sheriff, who subsequently placed both brothers under arrest. The article concluded by noting that further reporting on the matter had been suspended at the request of county officials pending a complete investigation. 2234, confirmed by weather records from the period, was the exceptional nature of the rainfall, with a local station recording over 9 inches of precipitation between October 26 and 29, 1890. Potentially compromising the structural integrity of any excavations would have been this deluge, coming after an unusually dry summer, saturating the clay-heavy soil of the hillside. 2258, subject to interpretation remains what exactly was exposed by the collapse, as the newspaper account deliberately avoided specifics. However, some indication is provided by a private letter from James Whitaker, the mine superintendent, to the company's main office in Philadelphia, dated November 1, 1890. Discovered among company papers in the state archives, the letter states only that a most disturbing discovery has been made regarding the Thornton operation and that several items of a nature too grim to detail in correspondence have been recovered from a previously unknown cellar room. 2334 concludes Whitaker's letter by assuring the company directors that the matter is being handled with the utmost discretion to avoid unnecessary alarm among the workforce and potential damage to the company's standing. In the Register or any other local publication, no follow-up story ever appeared. 2357 show court records from November and December 1890 that the brothers were held in custody, but no formal charges were ever filed. Notes a single entry in the sheriff's daily log dated December 17, 1890, Thornton matter resolved. Subjects remanded to State Hospital at Weston by judicial order. Site at Blackwood sealed by County Health Authority. 2400 hours 23 suggests the reference to Weston that the brothers were committed to the West Virginia Hospital for the Insane, later renamed Weston State Hospital. Though no admission records for either Samuel or Elijah Thornton appear in the facility's archived documents. Particularly notable given the apparent severity of whatever was discovered is the absence of formal charges or trial proceedings. 2400 hours 47 that this unusual handling might reflect several possibilities is suggested by legal scholars who have examined the case. Concerns about the ability to secure convictions given the circumstantial nature of evidence, a desire to avoid public scandal that might damage the mining operation's ability to attract workers, or perhaps most disturbing, a recognition that the full details of the brothers' activities were simply too horrific for public airing in the cultural context of the time. 25:20, a convenient resolution was represented by the commitment to a mental institution rather than prosecution, removing the brothers from society while avoiding the public exposure that a trial would necessitate. What happened to the boarding house itself is more curious still. According to property tax records, ownership of the structure reverted to the Blackwood Coal Company in January 1891. 25-44, however, rather than continuing its operation or selling it to new proprietors, the company designated the building as unsuitable for habitation and converted it to storage use only. Preserved in the archives of the now-defunct coal operation, a company memo instructed employees that the former boarding house was to be used exclusively for non-perishable equipment and that the rear portion of the property was to remain sealed and undisturbed. 26:15 concluded with an unusual directive. The memo, signed by the mine superintendent, no discussion of previous occupants or activities is permitted among company employees. 26:50 these measures, unusual for a simple slope stabilization project, suggest a concerted effort to permanently conceal something located in that area. The main structure of the boarding house remained standing but was surrounded by a sturdy fence with posted warnings about structural instability, despite there being no record of any damage to the building itself. 27:21 For the residents of Blackwood Hollow, this official silence fostered an atmosphere of unspoken dread. That while no one publicly discussed what had been discovered behind the Thornton Boarding House, private whispers maintained the collective memory is suggested by oral histories collected from descendants of miners who lived in the community during this period. 27:45 Grandfather would never eat meat stew after that time, recalled Mary Kleschuk in a 1958 interview with a folklore student from West Virginia University. He would never say why, but grandmother told me once it had to do with the bad house where men went missing. The whole town knew something terrible happened there, but it wasn't spoken of. 28:11 Though always with the same reluctance to specify details, similar accounts appear in several other oral histories. Beyond the immediate community extended this collective silence. An unusual gap in documentation regarding Blackwood Hollow is shown by county records from the period, with routine reports and correspondence suddenly becoming minimal and formalistic after November 1890. 28-36 Only the briefest mention of Blackwood in 1891 and 1892 is contained in the annual health inspector's reports, which had previously included detailed observations about conditions in various settlements throughout the county, noting simply that conditions meet minimum standards without the customary elaboration. 28:58 Similarly, the county sheriff's office, which had maintained regular correspondence with the mine superintendent regarding various matters of public order, abruptly reduced communication to formal acknowledgments of reports received. A broader institutional decision to minimize official attention to the community in the aftermath of whatever had been discovered is suggested by this pattern. 29:22 Perhaps most telling is the reaction of the immigrant community that had formed the primary clientele of the Thornton Boarding House. That in the 3 months following the brothers' arrest, more than 40 miners, predominantly those of Eastern European origin, departed Blackwood Hollow despite the continuing availability of work is indicated by company records. 29-46, occurring during winter months when mining jobs were typically most secure, this exodus, representing nearly 20% of the workforce, suggests that information about the nature of the Thornton operation had circulated among these workers despite the official silence. The foreign element has become increasingly difficult to retain, notes a company report from February 1891 with concern, necessitating increased recruitment efforts in neighboring operations. 30:17 Though it makes no connection to recent events, what exactly was discovered at the boarding house in October 1890 remained obscured for decades, with official records providing only the vaguest outlines. Troubling activities was mentioned by the newspaper account, while the sheriff's log referred only to the Thornton matter. 30:40 Carefully avoided specifics did company correspondence, referring obliquely to the regrettable incident or the matter behind the boarding house. A coordinated effort to minimize documentation of whatever had been found is suggested by this deliberate vagueness, maintained consistently across multiple sources. 31:13 From an unexpected source comes some indication of what might have been discovered, the personal diary of Dr. William Chambers, the county health officer from 1888 to 1896. Donated to the State Historical Society in 1978 remained Chambers' private journal, which would have been involved in any official response to the discovery, until being in his family's possession. 31:39, dated November 2, 1890 contains a cryptic but suggestive passage, called to BH regarding the tea matter. What we found exceeds the bounds of civilized contemplation. Identified remains of at least 3 individuals in various states of preparation. The implements suggest a methodical approach to an unthinkable process. Sheriff C. concurs that full disclosure would cause undue public distress. Recommended sanitization and commitment rather than criminal process. 32-01, the first documentary suggestion of what the hillside collapse might have revealed is provided by this brief entry with its references to remains, preparation, and implements. During its demolition in 1964 emerged the most compelling evidence of what actually occurred at the Thornton Boarding House. 32:33, by then, the Blackwood mine had been closed for over a decade, and the abandoned buildings of the once thriving community were being cleared for a never-completed development project. Workers discovered a sealed room in the cellar of the boarding house that contained several ledgers along with tools and implements that the report describes only as consistent with butchering operations, according to the site foreman's report filed with the County Development Commission. 33-02, what appeared to be detailed records of the boarding house operation from 1887 to 1890 was contained in the ledgers, which eventually made their way to a county archivist. Not their accounting of daily operations, but rather the additional notations that accompanied entries for certain boarders was what made these ledgers remarkable. 33:23, next to names that correspond with the 17 men who disappeared were annotations regarding weight, quality, and yield, followed by calculations of meals provided. What appeared to be recipes with unusual ingredient listings and preparation notes were additionally contained on several pages. 33:54, reportedly contacted the state police, the archivist who initially examined these materials, which led to a brief investigation in early 1965. However, according to internal memos obtained through a Freedom of Information request in 2002, the investigation was terminated after intervention from unspecified county officials who determined that no actionable evidence exists regarding matters occurred beyond statutory limitations. 34:16, the most direct evidence of the brothers' activities is provided by the ledgers themselves, though their clinical detachment makes them all the more disturbing. With meticulous attention to detail, the boarding house operation was documented in Samuel Thornton's distinctive hand, recording daily expenses, occupancy rates, and meal planning. 34:37, interspersed with these mundane business records, however, are entries that take on a horrific significance when considered alongside the disappearances. One such entry dated March 19, 1888, the day after Stanislaw Wojcik was officially terminated from employment, reads, SW processing complete. Initial yield approximate 58 kilos of usable material. Quality exceptional due to youth and condition. Particularly pleased with potential for extended usage in varied preparations. Conservative estimate of 225 to 255 meals at current occupancy. 35:08, following the dates of other known disappearances appear similar entries, each with calculations of yield and projected meal counts. More disturbing still are the recipe pages, which detail preparation methods for various dishes served at the boarding house. 35-34, while many are conventional recipes for bread, porridge, and vegetables, others contain references to special meat or reserved protein with specific instructions for preparation to mask distinctive characteristics. One entry titled simply Miner's Stew includes the notation, always combine with strong flavors, garlic, paprika, bay leaf. Important, ensure complete cooking to avoid recognition of source. Foreign miners prefer more heavily spiced preparations, making detection unlikely. 36-01, a calculated approach to serving human flesh to unsuspecting boarders is suggested by these clinical instructions, written with the same methodical attention that characterized the brothers' business operations. 36:25, with instructions that they remain sealed until 1999 were the ledgers and associated materials supposedly transferred to the State Historical Archives in Charleston. When researchers attempted to access these materials after that date, they were informed that the files had been misplaced during a reorganization of the archives in the late 1970s. 36:47, whether this represents an actual loss or a deliberate suppression remains subject to debate among historians interested in the case. What can be verified is that in 1966, all remaining structures in Blackwood Hollow were razed. The mine entrances were sealed, and the area was designated as part of a wildlife management area, effectively removing it from public access. 37:12, equally obscured remain the lives of the Thornton brothers after their apparent commitment to the asylum at Weston. For either man in West Virginia records exist no death certificates. However, documenting the admission of a Samuel T. with the notation transfer from West Virginia facility is an entry from March 1893 in a patient register from the Western Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane near Pittsburgh. 37:41, notes the entry his occupation as meat merchant and diagnosis as moral insanity with homicidal tendencies. No further records of his treatment or eventual fate have been located. As for Elijah Thornton, a single reference appears in the 1910 census for Washington County, Pennsylvania, listing an Eli Thornton, age 52, residing as a farmhand with the Whitaker family. 38:09, as West Virginia is listed his place of birth, though earlier records indicated both brothers had been born in Pennsylvania. Whether this represents the same individual cannot be conclusively determined. The broader pattern of institutional silence that surrounded the entire affair is reflected in the absence of clear records regarding the brothers' fate. 38:32, from the immediate aftermath with its lack of formal charges and newspaper coverage to the sealing of records and eventual loss of key documents, there appears to have been a sustained effort to minimize official documentation of what occurred in Blackwood Hollow. Across decades and involving multiple institutions extended this effort, suggesting a recognition that the events transcended ordinary crime and entered a realm that challenged fundamental social taboos. 39:02, the outline of events that officials at multiple levels apparently deemed too disturbing to maintain in public records is what emerges from this fragmented historical record. A collective trauma that deeply affected the community is suggested by the reluctance of local residents to discuss the matter even decades later. 39:23, Blackwood Hollow represented a curious case of communal silence that extended beyond typical instances of tragedy or disaster, noted Dr. Margaret Shelton, a historian specializing in Appalachian industrial communities, in a 1968 paper. In most mining communities, she wrote, disasters become part of local identity and shared narrative. In Blackwood, however, we see an active suppression of memory that suggests something beyond the pale of even the harsh realities these communities regularly faced. 39:48, not simply what appears to have been a series of murders is the most troubling aspect of the Thornton case, but rather the implication of what happened to the victims afterward. To a conclusion so disturbing that contemporary newspapers declined to state it explicitly and officials apparently determined that the public record should be purged of the details point the ledger entries with their clinical notations of yield and meals provided. 40:08, only the suggestion contained in the title that has persisted in local oral tradition are we left with in the absence of the missing documentation, the brothers who fed the boarding house. The awful truth that seems to have been deemed too horrific for historical record is contained in this phrase, passed down through generations of McDowell County residents. 40:37, merely kill their boarders did the Thornton brothers apparently not. They processed them as food that was then served to their remaining tenants. A practice of cannibalism that would have been almost unthinkable in late 19th century America is pointed to by the remarkably hearty meals that distinguished their establishment, the minimal purchases of meat from the company store, the specialized tools found in the cellar, and the detailed records of yield. 40:58, in essence, a closed system was operated by the brothers. Isolated immigrant workers with few connections disappeared one by one, while their remains, processed as food, were unwittingly consumed by the next wave of boarders. 41:22, only be imagined can the psychological impact of this revelation on the community once the nature of the brothers' operation became known. A violation of the most fundamental taboos would have been represented for workers who had boarded at the establishment by the realization of what they had unknowingly consumed. 41:53, perfect sense in this context makes the subsequent exodus of immigrant workers not simply a reaction to murder, but to an act that transcended ordinary criminality and violated basic human norms. Similarly, a recognition that such acts existed beyond the framework of conventional justice, threatening the social order itself if publicly acknowledged, is reflected in the decision by officials to suppress details rather than prosecute. 42:22, how the brothers avoided detection for nearly 3 years remains unexplained. A calculated approach to their activities is suggested by the careful spacing of disappearances, while a methodical attention to maintaining appearances is demonstrated by the forged documentation. 42:51, some historians have suggested that the remote location of the boarding house, positioned away from the main settlement, and the unusual autonomy granted to the brothers by the mining company, which was primarily concerned with maintaining a stable workforce, created conditions where such activities could remain undetected. 43:12, Little insight into their motivations is provided by the brothers' backgrounds. That before arriving in Blackwood Hollow, Samuel had indeed worked as a butcher in Pittsburgh, while Elijah had been employed in various kitchens is indicated by the limited information available. Located for either man prior to the events in West Virginia have been no criminal records, though this does not preclude the possibility of similar activities that went undiscovered. 43:42, that authorities viewed their actions as stemming from psychiatric disturbance rather than ordinary criminal intent is suggested by the commitment of both brothers to mental institutions rather than criminal prosecution. Though far from the modern understanding of mental illness were the standards for such determinations in the late 19th century. 44:03, the institutional response is perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the Thornton case, the apparent decision at multiple levels of authority to essentially erase the event from historical record. From the abrupt cessation of newspaper coverage to the sealing of the site, from the commitment of the brothers to an asylum rather than prosecution in criminal court to the eventual loss of the archival materials, there appears to have been a coordinated effort to suppress all documentation of what occurred in Blackwood Hollow. 44:36, that the events transcended ordinary crime and entered a realm of horror that threatened fundamental social norms is suggested by this. Beyond the immediate aftermath extended the impact on the community. 45:00, that Blackwood Hollow experienced difficulty attracting workers throughout 1891 and 1892 is shown by mining company records. Despite the general economic depression that typically made mining jobs more desirable, production declined steadily, with company reports noting increased costs for recruitment and higher than normal turnover rates. 45:28, somewhat had the workforce stabilized by 1893, but continuing concerns about the persistent negative associations that affected recruitment efforts are indicated by company correspondence. Except for storage remained unused the boarding house building itself, with a company memo from 1894 rejecting a proposal to renovate it for housing, noting simply that the structure remains unsuitable for habitation due to historical considerations that render it permanently undesirable. 45:55, gradually disappeared from maps and public memory did Blackwood Hollow in the decades following the Thornton case. After declining production, the mine closed in 1925, and the last residents departed by the early 1940s. Covered by secondary forest growth is today the site where the boarding house once stood, with only the faint outline of foundations visible to those who know where to look. 46:25, what occurred there is commemorated by no historical marker, and local tourism materials make no mention of Blackwood Hollow beyond noting it as one of many ghost towns of the coal era. Largely successful seems to have been the deliberate forgetting. 46:54, a cautionary tale told to children in several McDowell County communities about the bad brothers who ate miners was documented by folklorist Henry Glassy in 1957, though most parents he interviewed claimed ignorance of its historical basis. From an elderly miner who refused to provide his name and insisted that Lomax not publish the lyrics was recorded a ballad titled The Blackwood Hollow Boarding House by musicologist Alan Lomax in 1959. 47:23, that despite institutional efforts to erase the Thornton case, the collective memory retained at least the outline of events too horrific to forget completely is suggested by these cultural echoes. A common pattern in communities that have experienced events beyond the parameters of normal understanding is reflected in the transmission of the story through folklore rather than official history. 47:44, at least the essence of what occurred is often preserved by oral tradition when institutional records fail, whether through deliberate suppression or simple neglect. Despite its absence from written history, the very persistence of the Thornton story testifies to its impact on the collective consciousness of the region. 48:04, not simply